All came at 2047 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the base hospital in Bagram, and I was sitting on the edge of my cot pulling off my boots when my phone buzzed. It was a number I recognized. My stepfather's number. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken in 4 months, not since I deployed. And honestly, the silence had been a relief. But something made me pick up. Maybe it was exhaustion lowering my defenses. Maybe it was some stubborn, foolish piece of me still hoping that enough time and enough distance could soften a man like him. Natalie. His voice was the same as always. Flat, satisfied with itself. Figured you'd want to know. Sold the lake house this morning. Got a good price, too. Cash deal, close fast. You know how it is, debts don't wait around. I sat there with one boot in my hand. Your sister's been accepted to that design program in Italy, he continued. Florence, it's expensive, but she deserves it, don't you think? He paused, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. Not laughing, just smiling, which was somehow worse. Anyway, thought you should hear it from me. I said, thanks for letting me know. That was all. I hung up. I set my boot down on the floor, very carefully, and I sat there in the half-dark of a tent in Afghanistan. And I did not cry, and I did not scream, and I did not call him back to tell him what I thought of him. I just breathed, in and out, the way my father taught me when I was 8 years old and I'd scraped my knee badly enough to need stitches, and he'd held my hand in the truck on the way to urgent care and said, Nat, just breathe. Everything else can wait. My father built that lake house with his own hands, not metaphorically. He literally built it. Poured the foundation himself one summer, framed the walls of my uncle, laid the hardwood floors on his knees over 2 weeks the year I turned 12. I spent that whole summer handing him tools and drinking iced tea on the porch, and listening to him explain what each thing was for. Why you set the joists this way. How you read a level. Why the foundation has to be right before anything else matters. He died when I was 22, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone, he left the house to me. Just me. It was in his will, clearly stated, and it was the only asset of his that my mother and stepfather had managed to absorb into their shared life over the years of their marriage. The lake house was mine because my father had been very deliberate about that. He told me once, sitting on that same porch the summer before he got sick, "This place stays in our family, Natalie, your family, not anyone else's." I joined the army at 24, 2 years after he died, when I didn't know what else to do with the anger. I became a nurse, a good one, or so my commanding officers seemed to think. I was on my second deployment when my stepfather called to tell me he'd sold my house. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because my father and I had handled it quietly, just between us and a lawyer in Duluth named Mr. Fredrickson, whom my stepfather had never met, was that 6 months before my father died, he'd placed the lake house in an irrevocable trust, with me as the sole beneficiary, and a very specific provision that no transfer of the property could occur without my written and notarized consent. My stepfather had sold a house he did not own, and the man who bought it had purchased a property that was not for sale. I set my phone face down on my cot, lay back, and stared at the ceiling. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about the level floors. I thought about how he'd said the foundation has to be right before anything else matters. Then I went to sleep, because I had another shift in 6 hours. Let me go back a little, because you need to understand who my stepfather is, before you can understand what happened next. His name is Frank. He married my mother when I was 15, 2 years after my parents divorced. My father was quiet, careful, a man who fixed things and kept his word. Frank was loud, charming at parties, and perpetually in financial trouble that he described as temporary setbacks and opportunities in progress. My mother found this exciting. I found it exhausting. Frank had a daughter from his first marriage. My stepsister, Becca, she was 13 when our parents married, which made her 2 years younger than me, and she was the kind of beautiful teenager who knew exactly what she could get away with. She and I were never close. We were never enemies either. We just existed in the same house like two people assigned to the same waiting room. Polite, but not friends, sharing space without sharing anything real. When my father died and left me the lake house, Frank's attitude toward me changed. It was subtle at first, Little comments about how maintaining a second property is a lot of responsibility for someone so young. Questions about whether I'd thought about liquidating some assets to invest in my future. Suggestions that maybe a trust fund would be more practical than a physical property for a 22-year-old with no stable income yet. I ignored all of it. I went to my father's lawyer, updated my own paperwork, and deployed 18 months later. My mother, and this is the part that took me years to fully accept, my mother went along with whatever Frank wanted. Not because she was cruel. She isn't cruel. She's weak in the particular way that some people are weak, where their need to keep the peace is stronger than their ability to protect the people they love. She'd watched Frank drain their joint account twice, had co-signed loans she didn't fully understand, had let him fold her quiet, ordinary life into his loud, lurching one. And somewhere in all of that, she'd stop being the woman who taught me to stand up for myself and become someone who just hoped things would work out. When she told me, 3 months before I deployed, that Frank had been looking into options for the lake house property, I told her clearly, "Mom, that house is in a trust. It's not an option. It's not an available. Please make sure Frank understands that." She said she would. She didn't. Or she did, and he didn't listen, which amounts to the same thing in the end. I spent the first week after Frank's call going about my work exactly as normal. I changed dressings. I monitored patients. I attended briefings. I ate in the mess hall and made conversation and did not mention to anyone that my stepfather had attempted to commit real estate fraud from the comfort of his living room in Minnesota. On day 8, I found 20 minutes and a satellite connection, and I emailed Mr. Fredrickson. I kept the email short. I explained what Frank had told me. I asked Mr. Fredrickson to confirm the trust was intact and to look into whether any fraudulent sale documents existed. I told him I was deployed until March and asked him to begin whatever process needed beginning. Mr. Fredrickson responded within 2 hours. He was retired now, mostly, but he'd handled my family's affairs for 30 years, and he still had sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He confirmed the trust was intact and fully recorded with the county. He said he'd make a few calls. Then he called my cousin, Dana. This is important. Dana was the one person in my family who had always been completely uncomplicatedly on my side. She was my father's sister's daughter, 12 years older than me, an accountant in Minneapolis who wore sensible shoes and had absolutely no patience for nonsense. She'd been at my father's funeral. She'd helped me pack up his personal belongings afterward. She'd sat with me on that porch the week after he died and said nothing at all, which was exactly what I needed. Dana was the one who drove to the county recorder's office. Dana was the one who discovered that Frank had filed a fraudulent quitclaim deed using a forged signature, mine, to transfer the property out of the trust before selling it. He'd used a notary public in a suburb of Minneapolis named Terry Kowalski, who, it turned out, had lost his commission 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of thing, but was still operating illegally. Dana took photographs of everything. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, Minnesota time. It was past midnight for me, but I'd asked her to call whenever she found something. "Natalie," she said, "Frank forged your name." I already knew, not the specifics. I hadn't known about Kowalski, hadn't known about the quitclaim, but I'd known in my bones the minute Frank called me that he'd done something that would only work if I didn't find out, or didn't fight back, which told me everything about what he thought of me. "Okay," I said. "Okay, Natalie, this is a felony. I know. What's the buyer's situation?" Dana paused. "The buyer's a couple from Wisconsin. They closed in good faith. They have a family." "Then we protect them too," I said. "They didn't do anything wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like your dad." I didn't respond to that because I was fairly sure if I did, I would start crying in the dark of a forward operating base in Afghanistan, and I had 3 more hours of shift to finish. "Start the process," I said instead. "I'll be home in March." March came the way it always does after a long deployment. Suddenly, then all at once. I landed in Minneapolis on a Tuesday. Dana picked me up at the airport. She didn't make a big production of it. She brought coffee and a breakfast sandwich from the place I'd liked since high school, and she drove, and she briefed me the way she would brief a client, which I appreciated. The forged deed had been flagged. Kowalski had already been referred to the county attorney. Frank's buyer, the family from Wisconsin, a couple named the Hendersons, had been contacted by Mr. Fredrickson's associate and informed of the situation. They were understandably upset. Their real estate attorney had joined the legal chain. The title insurance company had been notified. There were now, according to Dana's count, 6 different parties involved in unwinding the fraudulent transaction. Frank did not know that I was home. He didn't know because my mother hadn't told him. My mother, apparently, had known something was wrong for months. She'd found documents in Frank's home office, printouts of the county recorder's website, notes in his handwriting about the property value, the name Kowalski, and she had not confronted him. But she had also, quietly, not told him when Dana called her to ask about my return date. I don't know if that makes up for anything. I decided it wasn't my job to decide that yet. Dana drove me to her apartment, where I showered and changed and ate a real meal for the first time in a long time. And then we drove together to the offices of a man named Mr. Garrett, who was the attorney we'd retained for the civil case. Mr. Garrett was small, precise, and had the particular demeanor of someone who had spent decades watching people underestimate him and finding it professionally useful. He shook my hand, looked at me for a moment, and said, "Captain, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Warrant officer," I corrected automatically, "and likewise." He laid out the situation plainly. The forged deed meant the sale was void. The Hendersons would be made whole through the title insurance claim. Their money would be returned. The transaction unwound. Frank and Kowalski faced felony charges, forgery, fraudulent real estate transaction, potentially wire fraud given the interstate nature of the deal. My stepfather had exposed himself to criminal liability, civil liability, and the near-certain loss of any real estate or financial assets he currently held as settlement leverage. "What does my mother's exposure look like?" I asked. Mr. Garrett looked at me carefully. "There's no evidence your mother had direct knowledge of or participation in the fraud. She may be called as a witness, but she is not a target." I nodded. "Do you want to pursue maximum damages?" he asked. "I want the house back," I said. "I want the house back," I said. "I want the Hounses to be made whole, and I want it on record what he did, so he can't do it to anyone else." Mr. Garrett wrote something down. "That's straightforward, we can do that." I hadn't planned to see Frank before the legal process was fully underway. Mr. Garrett had actually advised against it, but 3 days after I got home, my mother called and asked me to come to the house. She said Frank was there and she thought we should all talk. Her voice was careful and thin, the way it gets when she's trying to hold too many things together at once. I asked Dana to drive me. Frank was in the living room when I arrived. He was wearing a polo shirt and had a coffee mug in his hand, and he looked, for a moment, like any ordinary man in any ordinary house. And then he saw my face and something shifted behind his eyes. "Natalie," he said, like we'd just not seen each other for a while. My mother was standing near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, looking at the floor. "Frank," I said. "I didn't sit down. I know about the quitclaim deed. I know about the quitclaim deed. I know about Kowalski. I know about the Hendersons." He started to say something. I kept going. "The house is in a trust. You have known that for years. You forged my signature, used a disbarred notary, and sold property you had no legal claim to. The county attorney's office has been notified. The title insurance company is unwinding the transaction as we speak. My attorney is filing the civil complaint this week." Frank set his coffee mug down. His face had gone through several things quickly: surprise, then anger, then something that tried to look like indignation and didn't quite get there. "You've been deployed," he said, which wasn't an argument, just a thing he said. "I was aware of that," I said. "The debts were real. The pressure was real. I had no choice. You had a choice," I said. My voice was even, not cold, just level. "You had the choice to not forge my signature on a legal document. You had the choice to not sell property that did not belong to you. Those were choices you made. I didn't make them for you." He looked at my mother. She didn't look back at him. Something in his face changed then. Not remorse exactly, more like a man recognizing that a door he thought was open has been closed and locked. "I'll fight it," he said. "That's your right," I said. "My attorney is very much looking forward to that." I walked out. Dana was waiting in the car. She handed me the other half of a granola bar without a word, which is exactly the kind of person she is, and I ate it sitting in the passenger seat while the adrenaline slowly left my hands. Okay? She asked. Yeah, I said. Yeah, I said. Yeah, I'm okay. The legal process took 8 months. I want to be honest about that, because the version of the story where justice arrives quickly and cleanly isn't the real one. Frank's attorney filed motions. There were depositions. The criminal case moved at its own separate pace from the civil case, which moved separately from the title insurance claim. There were months where I was living in Dana's spare bedroom, working part-time at a veterans clinic, attending meetings with Mr. Garrett and waiting for documents and dates. The Hendersons, to their great credit, were gracious throughout the whole thing. I spoke with the wife, a woman named Ruth, twice by phone. She told me she had a daughter around my age and that she was glad I'd fought it. I told her I was sorry she'd been caught in the middle. She said that wasn't my fault. It wasn't, but I was still sorry. Kowalski pled guilty and surrendered what remained of his notary assets, which was not much. His cooperation was part of the plea deal, which meant his testimony against Frank was secured early. Frank pled no contest to the forgery charge in month 7. His attorney negotiated down from felony to gross misdemeanor on the real estate fraud, which was a compromise I found frustrating but which Mr. Garrett explained was the realistic outcome given the specifics. He paid restitution. He paid the civil settlement. He paid my legal fees. He paid the Hendersons' costs in full through the title insurance payout, which was ultimately recovered from him. His credit was destroyed. The business he'd been running, a small property management company, which was deeply ironic in retrospect, was dissolved. He and my mother separated. I don't know if they'll divorce. That's between them. My mother called me 3 days after Frank pled. She said she was sorry. She said she'd known something was wrong for a long time and she hadn't stopped it, and she was sorry for that. She sounded small and tired. I told her I heard her. I wasn't ready to say more than that. The lake house was formally redeeded back to the trust in October. Mr. Batting, Fredrickson, signed off on the paperwork himself, even though he was supposed to be retired. He said he wouldn't have missed it. I drove up the first weekend of November. Alone. The trees had already turned, most of the leaves down by then, the lake gray and quiet. I had the keys my father had given me when I turned 18, an old brass key with a worn edge, and I unlocked the front door and stood in the doorway for a long time before I went inside. The house was cold. The Hendersons had not moved in. The transaction had been stopped before they could occupy the property, but it had sat empty for months and had that feeling empty houses get, like they're holding their breath. I turned on the heat. I found the old quilt my father kept on the back of the couch. I made instant coffee from a packet in the pantry and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat as a 12-year-old asking my father what a joist was. Outside the window, the lake was flat and still. I thought about my father's hands again. I thought about how we built this floor and I was sitting on it. I thought about his voice on that porch. This place stays in our family, Natalie. I kept my word, Dad. It stayed. I want to say something directly to anyone who's been in a version of this situation. Not a legal one necessarily. Not everyone has a trust and a Fredrickson and a Dana. But the version where someone who was supposed to protect you made a decision about your life while you were too far away to stop them in time. The version where you're sitting in the dark after a 12-hour shift trying to figure out how to hold what you just heard. Here's what I know. Being calm is not the same as being passive. Taking your time is not the same as letting it go. Some people read my reaction, "Thanks for letting me know," hanging up, going to sleep, as weakness. Frank certainly did. That's fine. Let people misread your stillness. My father didn't build this house with urgency. He built it carefully, one piece at a time, in the right order, on a foundation that he made sure was level before he put anything else on top of it. That's the only way anything worth keeping gets built. The lake is still gray and quiet outside. The coffee is bad, but it's hot. The heat is starting to work, and the house is warming up around me, and the old quilt smells the same as it always did, and I am home. I've thought a lot about why Frank made the choices he made. Not to excuse them. There's no version of forging someone's signature that deserves an excuse, but because understanding it matters if you want to learn anything useful from it. Frank was a man who spent his whole life looking for the shortcut. Not because he was lazy exactly, but because he genuinely believed that the rules were for people who hadn't figured out how to work around them yet. He saw my father's careful planning, the trust, the lawyer, the quiet, deliberate way my dad did things, and he interpreted it as naivety. He thought my father had left a door unlocked. He thought I was too young, too far away, too distracted by deployment to notice or fight back in time. That's where he was wrong. And the reason he was wrong is the reason I want to talk about for a minute. My father didn't build things quickly, he built them right. He spent weeks on floors that no one would ever look at closely. Not because he needed anyone to notice, but because he understood that the quality of what you build in private determines what holds when pressure arrives. The trust wasn't a complicated legal maneuver. It was just my father doing what he always did. Thinking ahead, doing the work, making sure the foundation was solid before anything else went on top of it. I inherited that from him. Not just the house. The habit of thinking ahead. Of not reacting in the moment when patience is the smarter play. When Frank called me at 2047 in the morning and told me what he'd done, my calm wasn't detachment, it was recognition. I already knew what the foundation looked like. I already knew it would hold. There's something that happens to people who cut corners their whole lives. Not punishment in any cosmic sense. Just the simple mechanical consequence of building on weak ground. Frank had been accumulating shortcuts for years. Bad loans. Forged documents. A disbarred notary working out of a suburb. Every one of those was a crack he introduced into something he thought he owned. And when it came time for that structure to bear any real weight, a legal challenge, a county recorder's office, a determined woman who'd just flown home from a forward operating base, it didn't hold. It couldn't. He never given it the chance to. Dana likes to say that Frank handed me the win the minute he called to brag. She's not wrong. But I think it goes further than that. He handed me the win the minute he decided that my father's careful work was an obstacle to move around rather than a boundary to respect. That decision told me exactly who I was dealing with. And it told me exactly how much patience I needed. 8 months is a long time to wait. There were hard days in there. Days in Dana's spare bedroom, wondering if the legal process would actually work the way it was supposed to. Days when I thought about my mother and felt the complicated grief of loving someone who let you down. Days when I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. But I kept coming back to what my father built, not the house, the habit. The belief that if you do the right thing in the right order, and you don't panic, and you don't take shortcuts, what you build will still be standing when the pressure comes. It was. That's the only thing I know how to pass on from all of this. Not strategy. Not legal advice. Just that, build carefully. Build honestly. And trust that the foundation you lay in private will be the thing that saves you when someone else tries to take what's yours.